There are a few games and franchises out there that you've probably heard of that really shaped modern gaming and were truly revolutionary for their time. Pong arguably kicked things off, Mario carved out the platformer landscape, Doom and Quake pioneered the FPS genre, and there are several more that were so ahead of their time that they solidified their names in the Gaming Hall of Fame, all for different reasons. But the game series we'll be talking about today is arguably one of the most iconic and recognizable franchises of all time. A series that paved the way with imaginative and immersive world building and some insane storytelling in a genre not known for it, truly years ahead of its time. But that's just it, for its time. Now today, I want to take a critical view of what the franchise looks like in 2024 and if I still think it holds its own against the titans of today. And that series is Bioshock. My name is BigWynter, and let's dive into Rapture. Before we crack on, of course, there are going to be some spoilers going forward, so you have been warned. Plus, Bioshock 1 came out 17 years ago, and I know, like me, it's been sitting in your Steam library since at least 2016, so that's kind of on you at this point. And to save you some time, I'll be reviewing all three games, so I won't be going into any crazy detail, and I'll split things into three main categories: graphics and visuals, combat and mechanics, and finally story and world building before I give my closing thoughts and ratings. If you don't want to watch the whole video, that's fine. I'll leave timestamps to my ratings for each of the games in each of the three categories to save you from the spoilers. So like many of you who clicked on this video, I've never played the Bioshock franchise until 2024, so this video is not tainted by the beer goggles of nostalgia, but stay tuned until the end, as despite almost being old enough to drink in the UK, this franchise might just surprise you. So before we dive into the three categories, let me paint you a brief overview of the games before we dissect them. As a very brief timeline of things, it goes Bioshock Infinite, set in Columbia, Bioshock 1, set in Rapture, and finally Bioshock 2, also set in Rapture. Now, you don't have to play them in that order, and personally, I just recommend playing them in the order released, being Bioshock 1, 2, and then Infinite. The games themselves are FPS titles, but unlike the multiplayer themes at the time of their release back in 2007, which, by the way, was absolutely stacked for releases, this series is exclusively single player and focuses heavily on a narrative and storytelling experience. So if you were hoping for some suited up Big Daddy PvP combat, then that actually sounds awesome, but I guess you should probably go play some Titanfall 2 multiplayer. The common themes between all three games revolve around your use of weapons in combination with a number of supernatural abilities to traverse the levels, defeat combatants, and progress the main storylines for each respective game, discovering more and more about the goings-on in the secret societies of both Rapture, set deep beneath the ocean, and in Columbia, up in the clouds. But that's it for the loose summary. Let's just jump straight into the graphics and visuals. Now, despite having an initial release date of 2007, I didn't actually play the original Bioshock 1 or 2. I played the remasters, which were released in 2016 and 2020 respectively, because let's be honest, why would I want to play an objectively worse version of the game? But with that said, let's start with Bioshock 1, and I have to say I was actually very pleasantly surprised with the visuals once I actually got the game working. By default, it launches through the 2K launcher in what I swear is a 480p window, which made me instantly regret installing, but it was easily rectified within the settings. Now, I definitely wouldn't win any awards for best visuals by today's standards, but it was more than enough for me to get sufficiently immersed, and I most certainly did. I'm somewhat torn if this should be in the world building or the graphics section, but screw it, we'll just talk about it here. The art style is beyond outstanding, but also did personally kind of creep me out a bit. Comparing it to similar shooter games at the time, the art style is such a classic and iconic choice, and it adds so much to the immersive nature of the storytelling experience. But on a more negative note, despite having a unit of a PC, I actually did experience some performance issues, not in the way of artifacting or drop frames like you might expect, but I live streamed all three games, twitch.tv/BigWynter, and I found that with Bioshock 1, tabbing back into the game actually caused OBS to straight up crash and kill the stream entirely, which is obviously not ideal, so bear that in mind if you wanted to stream or record your experience. But back to the positive, with Bioshock 2, this theme of being impressed by the visuals only increased as you might expect. The art style was the same, with it being set in the same city of Rapture, but there were some obvious improvements that you would expect with a sequel in the series. I'm also happy to report that this OBS crashing feature, if you'd want to call it that, was not present when I streamed through Bioshock 2, but I had a different issue instead. Whilst OBS didn't crash at all, the game would from time to time, resulting in some lost progress since the last autosave, which was a bummer. But I found rebinding my autosave key to something accessible and routinely slapping it put a plaster on the issue, or a band-aid for you Americans. I don't know if this issue was exclusive to the remaster of Bioshock 2, or maybe just me. Perhaps you guys could let me know in the comments below if you happen to find out. Moving on to Bioshock Infinite, oh boy, this is where the visuals start to actually get pretty damn impressive. Now again, if it were released today, it wouldn't win any awards, but for 2016, damn does this game look good. Set now within Colombia, which I will touch more on later, the visuals take a massive turn in aesthetic choice relative to the first two games in the franchise. No longer is the underwater Art Deco aesthetic present, but now we're in the clouds with a more early 20th century America steampunk vibe to the cityscape. Personally, not only do I think the textures and quality is so much better within Bioshock Infinite, but aesthetically I find it so much more appealing to look at. As I said, the first two kind of creeped me out a little visually, although that was kind of the point and the vibe that 2K were going for. Now, to give ratings as per today's standards of visuals, if I'm brutally honest, I'd give Bioshock 1 Remastered maybe a 5.5, Bioshock 2 a 6, and Bioshock Infinite a solid 8. As I said, no awards would be dished out today, but the artistic style of the franchise and the polish each game saw in succession makes for a great visual experience overall. And to settle the online debate, the big daddies in Bioshock 1 are way cooler than in 2. There, I said it, come at me. Next, let's take a look-see at the combat and mechanics within the franchise, as I think this is where Bioshock began to make a name for itself relative to the other games of the time. Starting again with Bioshock 1, I wouldn't exactly say I was disappointed, but the combat and mechanics definitely do not hold up quite as well relative to the standards of today. The gunplay felt very dated, a little clunky, and whilst having access to a plethora of weapons and special abilities is cool and was pretty revolutionary for 2007, I think the game was somewhat limited by the UI design of the time. Often in combat, if you wanted to swap to a new weapon or ability, there wasn't really any smooth way of doing so, and more often than not, you'd find yourself fumbling around your hotbars of both weapons and abilities whilst getting absolutely jumped. Now, before you say skill issue, that might honestly be fair. Speaking of getting jumped though, there are a pretty varied amount of different enemy types to deal with, resulting in a good variety of combat and gameplay. But I played all three games on hard, and honestly, I wouldn't recommend it. The game shines primarily as a narrative experience, and I found on hard it was just pointlessly difficult at points rather than being satisfying and rewarding to beat. Another key mechanic throughout all three games is the hacking. To begin with in Bioshock 1, I actually found it pretty fun, and I didn't see why it got all the hate that it did. But as the game progressed, I began to absolutely loathe it. It's essentially a pathing minigame where you need to get the fluid from A to B, but in the late game, the puzzles are next to impossible and are completely subject to RNG. This wouldn't be an issue if you didn't have to do it that much, but if you want to open doors, safes, and control turrets, you kind of have to do it, which was more than frustrating at times. Another key aspect of the combat and mechanics was gathering Eve from the Little Sisters, which are guarded by the iconic Big Daddies. Personally, I really enjoyed prepping for and engaging with these absolute units for the most part, but on hard, some Big Daddies have a rivet gun, which can easily two-shot you the second a pixel of your shoulder appears, which is absolutely busted, and you end up spending a ton of resources on these bad boys. And finally, here on Bioshock 1, I'll touch on the actual level design. Now, if you Google Bioshock level design, you'll probably see a ton of salty comments talking about how boring, repetitive, and linear it is, which I honestly somewhat agree with, but not quite so drastically. I will say that in almost every level of the game, your path is blocked until you gather X amount of Y thing, and you have to kill the Big Daddies around. That is true, but paired with the storytelling, this is in no way boring, at least to me. So moving on to Bioshock 2, the core aspects of gameplay are pretty much the same with some added polish and a couple of small changes. Now, the first changes were the gunplay and combat, which I personally found a ton smoother than Bioshock 1. The weapons were less clunky and more satisfying to use, and swapping your abilities was so much easier. Rather than having two hotbars to clumsily juggle like in the first game, you have a hot swap key for your abilities and an activation button, which made a huge difference but still wasn't quite right. Similarly, I still wouldn't recommend playing it on hard, as it was just senselessly difficult at points. The next change was to the hacking, which was massively improved in my opinion. Instead of RNG-based pathing, it was the classic stop the needle in the green minigame, which was far more skill-based and satisfying to do. Well done, 2K. But one change I actually did dislike was the change to the Big Daddy fights and Eve harvesting. Now, spoilers here, but you play as a Big Daddy in Bioshock 2. Obviously, it wouldn't be quite the same as Bioshock 1. And personally, the added stage of having to defend the Little Sisters after the Big Daddy fight as they get the Eve for you was honestly just a little too time-consuming and got progressively more boring as the game went on. Back to the improvements, at different points in the game, you actually do get to play as a couple of different characters, which leads to a greater diversity in gameplay and was especially cool for the time. And level design wise, I also just saw a flat increase in objective variety from the first game. Finally, from this section, onto Bioshock Infinite, I would say all aspects of the game were massively improved, especially in the UI experience. I found the gunplay and ability control controls so much smoother and much more akin to a modern title. Rather than any hotbar juggling, 2K opted for a slow time wheel for the abilities, which was such a relief to see and resulted in far fewer fumble-related deaths. In terms of enemy design, combat encounters, and objective material, Bioshock Infinite was just leagues ahead in my opinion from the other two games, but I did miss the big daddies because these guys. With it being set in the clouds, there was also this added element of verticality, and with the sky rails and sky hooks, the movement felt so much more fluid and less claustrophobic than the gameplay experience within the first two Rapture-based titles. Plus, with the added element of, let's just say, Elizabeth-based abilities, it left the whole mechanic-based experience so much more enjoyable. But if I am to be nitpicky, your sensitivity is slowed whenever you sprint, which was not present in the first two games, and I personally hate this. Like, I get why it's there, I just feel so restricted by it myself. Additionally, there was no hacking mechanic in Bioshock Infinite. Rather, 2K opted for a lockpick mechanic that Elizabeth would auto-succeed at if you had enough lockpicks. Whilst I found this a lot less engaging than Bioshock 1 and 2, I really didn't mind and did not miss the hacking mechanic at all. But finally onto the ratings for mechanics and gameplay, I'd give Bioshock 1 a somewhat lackluster 4.5, Bioshock 2 a 6, and Bioshock Infinite a really respectable 8. Whilst the 4.5 and a 6 might indicate some pretty shoddy games, trust me, that is not the case, and this next section will put so much more into perspective. And that section is the story and the world building. Of course, it should go without saying, but this section will be full of the most spoilers, so you have been warned. I'll also refrain from going into too much detail so you can experience all the twists and the turns for yourself. As I mentioned earlier, the timeline goes Bioshock Infinite, set in the clouds, Bioshock 1, set in Rapture, and Bioshock 2 following. But let's start with Bioshock 1, in which you play as Jack. The game starts with you in a plane before crashing into the ocean and discovering this hidden underwater metropolis of Rapture, which seems to be in some state of disarray and decay. Throughout the game, your core objective is to descend further into Rapture and discover the city's secrets and exactly what it is that you're doing here. And this is where I think Bioshock really begins to stand out and solidifies itself as a franchise within the gaming Hall of Fame. Along your journey, you'll be aided, hindered, and crossed at various intersections by various different enemies and characters along the narrative experience. I'd heard bits and pieces about Bioshock over the years and how its storytelling was second to none, but even going in with these high expectations, I was really surprised at just how hooked I was in the story and how shook I was every time the narrative took a different turn. I only need to say the phrase "would you kindly," and those of you that know. It is by no stretch of the imagination that I'd say Bioshock 1's storyline is one of the greatest narrative experiences in gaming history. Additionally, the iconic Little Sisters play such a massive role within the lore and world building of Rapture, but also brought something huge into gaming that a lot of people seem to overlook. Depending on how you play the game, there are a variety of different outcomes and endings, not only resulting in some serious replayability, but this was probably one of the most influential morality-based mechanics that made its way into gaming, alongside other classics like Mass Effect. I would also add that Bioshock 1 is one of those games where the more you put in to discover the world building, the more you get out of it. Now, I'm not usually a fan of having to read a ton of databank or lore entries to understand what's going on in the game, but the audio recordings of Bioshock reveal so much more than just the main storyline, adding even more to the game. Genuinely so impressed. Now, moving on to Bioshock 2, honestly, much more of the same. The intro scene is actually set before the events of Bioshock 1, but the gameplay side of things takes place following the chaos caused in the first game. Instead of Jack, you actually play as a Big Daddy yourself, but not quite the same as those within the first game. And rather than descending deeper into the depths to discover the secrets of the city, you'll be in pursuit of the little sister that you were bonded to within the first opening cutscene, who is the centerpiece for your opposing party. The game follows the same theme as the first game, with a multitude of morality choices you make throughout your journey, resulting in a variety of different endings based on those choices. Similarly, the more you put into the game searching for audio recordings, the more of an immersive experience you end up with. I've seen a lot of people online slating the Bioshock 2 storyline, but I feel that this is a little unjustified. I do agree that the storyline itself is a bit weaker and maybe less enjoyable than the first, but that doesn't mean it's bad by any means. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and personally, as the gameplay mechanics and visuals were a significant improvement over the first game, there is the argument that Bioshock 2 would be the more immersive experience, as you're not battling the UI as much and have more time to focus on the narrative itself. But finally, on storyline and world building, let's talk about Bioshock Infinite. Set before the events of Bioshock 1, we actually jump back in time, playing this time as Booker, who has been charged with locating a girl in the floating city of Columbia in early 20th century America. Further spoilers here, but the game features a huge theme of temporal manipulation, aka alternate dimensions and time travel, which I know is not everyone's cup of tea, but I think it worked so well here and was really ambitious for the time, still holding up conceptually today. Personally, I loved the world building of Columbia a lot more than Rapture. This, along with the massive improvements to the The UI and mechanics, visuals, and complexity of the plot led to a much more immersive experience, at least to me. However, some people have been pretty upset with the actual story and plot of Bioshock Infinite, as there was a distinctive lack of morality choices and alternate endings like we see in the first two games. But I don't think this should matter, and the actual immersive experience was fantastic. And whilst everyone who played had the same ending, it was a fantastic ending and probably left a ton of people's brains melting out their ears, much like myself, as you can see here. I do totally understand the comments around various plot holes, but if you actually listen to a lot of the dialogue, especially with the Lutesses, it starts to make a little more sense, and I've made my peace with it. But to give my ratings for this section of world building and story, I'd give Bioshock 1 a 9, Bioshock 2 a 7, and Bioshock Infinite a 9 as well. One piece of advice I would give if you are planning to dust these bad boys at your Steam library is don't make the same mistake that I did. I played all three games back to back to back, and I was fairly Bioshocked out by the time I got to Infinite. So to give each of their games a fair go, play them at your own pace and make sure you slot in other games around them. And with that, I'd 100% say this franchise is still worth playing in 2024, especially true if you go into them full well knowing some of the limitations of the earlier two games. But that's it, friends. If you're still watching at this point, thank you so much. Drop a like and sub if you've enjoyed or you found this helpful. I really appreciate it. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on the franchise, which game was your favorite, and what I should cover next on the channel. Take care and much love.